A bill sponsored by Virginia Congressman James Walkinshaw has passed the House. The legislation would rename a Fairfax post office in honor of the late Congressman Jerry Connolly. We're also following recent questions in the Commonwealth surrounding ICE enforcement, fentanyl trafficking, and the growing impact of data centers. Congressman Walkinshaw joining me this morning. Thank you so much for taking the time, Congressman.
Thanks for having me.
Let's go ahead and start with your move to honor the late Jerry Connolly. I know the House has passed your bill to rename the Fairfax post office in his honor. Can you give us an idea, of what this recognition would mean to his family and really to the community that he served?
Yeah, I was really excited this week when my legislation to name the post office in Fairfax, it's the one that's near the courthouse on Page Avenue after the late Congressman Jerry Connolly. He was a passionate fighter for our community in Fairfax for decades and for the Postal Service. He was a leader in Congress on Postal Service reform legislation. He really believed in the power of the Postal Service to bind our communities and our nation together. So I'm excited about this. We're looking forward to Senate passage as well, getting this signed into law and getting that post office named in his honor.
All right, certainly. Let's talk a little bit about today's Senate hearing, focusing on Todd Blanche's nomination for Attorney General. Look, I know you've been outspoken about his role in the Epstein files. In fact, you said on X, every senator now has a choice: stand with survivors or be complicit in the cover-up. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, Todd Blanche has been the person most responsible for, in my view, the Trump administration's cover-up of the Epstein files. We passed a law that said the files needed to be released. He's failed to release all of the files. He has illegally redacted files, some of those that I have viewed at the Department of Justice, clearly illegally redacted to prevent President Trump, from being embarrassed. So I think Todd Blanche has put his loyalty to Donald Trump above both his oath of office and his responsibility to the survivors of Epstein's crimes, and I hope senators will recognize that.
Let's talk about ICE. I know you're on the Homeland Security Committee responsible for overseeing ICE, and after 2 fatal shootings in less than a week, look, the agency says it's suspending most vehicle stops. It's now requiring at least 1 officer to have a body camera. And to some degree, we have seen ICE change its tactics, so we haven't been seeing the large-scale deportations that we had seen in the past. But you've been vocal about this in terms of accountability. What does it look like at this point? Because I would say the body cameras would be a win in terms of what you fought for. Masks being taken off have not been successful, other things like that. But where do we go from here?
Yeah, if you go back to the things that a lot of us were fighting for months ago, it was the body cameras, it was the mask, but it also was the training. And what we heard from ICE this week is they're going to stop doing traffic stops, those vehicle stops, until they can better train their officers to conduct them safely. I wish they had taken us up on that offer months ago. Perhaps these 2 individuals would still be alive and these tragedies wouldn't have occurred. I think it highlights that despite, you're absolutely right, the kind of large-scale surge of ICE and DHS agents into Chicago and Minneapolis and other cities isn't occurring. Below the radar, the rate of deportations hasn't slowed. In fact, it has continued, and these very aggressive, sometimes violent detentions are still occurring.
Okay, committee hearings are still the best way to hold them accountable?
That's right, although both House and Senate, Republicans control the agenda, so they decide what hearings are held. We did have Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen before the Homeland Security Committee last month, and he was asked tough questions about these issues. Unfortunately, we still seem to have these really serious public safety challenges created by their policies.
Let's talk about data centers. They continue to be such a major issue in Northern Virginia, right? Governor Spanberger has argued recently that data center developers, not Virginia taxpayers, should bear the cost of those major transmission projects. Do you agree with that approach?
Absolutely. Look, we recognize data centers are part of the modern economy. I think those of us here in Northern Virginia and Virginia, even when we recognize that, don't feel like they all need to be in Northern Virginia. But data centers need to pay their share. They need to pay for the electricity that they're using and the infrastructure needed to get the electricity to their data centers. Communities have to have a real voice in terms of where they're located. We got to have strong environmental protections around the diesel generators, water use and reuse. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. Look, there are parts of the country that will welcome data centers right now where it's appropriate to put them, and parts of the country and parts of our region where it isn't.
How do you ensure that those costs are not ultimately passed on to consumers? Because I hear you saying, yes, the taxpayer should not shoulder that. I think there's been enough outcry that people would agree with you resoundingly on that point. But if you were talking to one of your constituents, how do you, assure them that that will actually happen?
Well, it is a complicated regulatory question, and for the most part, the decisions are made at the state level here in Virginia with the State Corporation Commission and the General Assembly. I'm looking at some legislation that would create a federal agency to find suitable locations for data centers, but then also require those data centers to pay upfront the cost of their interconnection, their connection to the electrical grid, to ensure that that infrastructure cost isn't spread among the non-data center ratepayers.
Look, I understand, courting business, and I understand the benefits to data centers coming into Virginia, but at the same time, you're kind of tap dancing around protecting communities from the impact of things like, energy, infrastructure, how to protect neighborhoods and schools and zoning and boundaries and all of that. Anything you would say to our audience about how you are working to actively protect them in the midst of also trying to be business friendly?
Well, I'm not tap dancing around at all, and I was in local government a year ago, and we worked hard to make sure data centers were steered toward industrial areas here in Fairfax County, and I think that's the right path. There are appropriate locations for data centers and inappropriate locations for data centers. It's appropriate for data centers to pay their full share. We got to work together at the federal, state, and local level to ensure that that happens, and it is absolutely inappropriate, unacceptable for ratepayers to be shouldering the cost of data centers' electricity usage.
We've certainly heard Virginia voters echo that sentiment. Virginia Congressman James Walkinshaw, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.